The whole town of Red Hollow had a cruel sense of humor. It was the kind of place where laughter was louder than kindness, and pride mattered more than mercy. And that afternoon, under the burning western sun, they gathered to witness what they believed would be the greatest joke they had ever played. The victim, a quiet cowboy named Caleb Boone. Caleb wasn't like the others. He didn't drink much, didn't gamble, didn't fight unless he had to. He worked harder than anyone, spoke less than anyone, and carried something in his eyes that made people uncomfortable: dignity. And dignity, in a town like Red Hollow, made you a target. The sheriff had started it. If Caleb wants a wife so bad, he had laughed inside the saloon, slamming his glass down. Let's give him one! But not just any wife. They chose Eliza May. Eliza hadn't walked in 3 years. An accident, a wagon crash, a broken spine. Since then, she lived in the back room of her uncle's house like forgotten furniture. Some said she was beautiful once. Some said she still was. But beauty didn't matter in Red Hollow if you couldn't stand on your own 2 feet. So they arranged it like a spectacle. They told Caleb he had won a town blessing, a bride chosen for him so he wouldn't die alone. They dressed it up like charity. But behind every grin was mockery. Caleb stood outside the church that afternoon, hat in hand, unsure why the whole town had gathered. Then they rolled her out. Eliza sat in a wooden wheelchair, wearing a simple cream dress. No veil, no flowers, just quiet humiliation in her soft brown eyes. She kept her hands folded in her lap, fingers trembling slightly. The crowd snickered. Caleb's jaw tightened. The sheriff stepped forward. "Caleb Boone, meet your bride." Silence spread across the dusty street. Eliza didn't look at him. She couldn't, because she already knew. This wasn't a marriage. It was punishment, a joke. And for a long moment, Caleb said nothing. The town leaned forward, waiting for him to laugh, or refuse, or walk away. Instead, he did something no one expected. He stepped forward, slowly, deliberately. He knelt in front of her, not to inspect, not to pity, to see her. "Eliza May," he said quietly, his voice steady as stone, "do you want this?" Her eyes lifted then, confused, wounded, searching. "No one's asked me that before," she whispered. The laughter faded. Caleb stood up and turned toward the crowd. "If this is a joke," he said calmly, "then it's on you, not her." The sheriff scoffed. "You gonna refuse?" Caleb looked back at Eliza. Her face was pale, but there was fire buried in her eyes. He made his choice in that second. "I don't refuse people," he said. And then he did something that silenced Red Hollow forever. He picked her up. Not roughly, not awkwardly. He lifted her into his arms like she weighed nothing. Gasps filled the air. Her hands instinctively clutched his vest. She felt solid strength beneath her fingers, steady, unwavering. "If she's my bride," he said, loud enough for every cruel soul to hear, "then she'll never roll behind anyone again. She'll be carried." And he walked, straight down the center of town. Not rushed, not ashamed. Pride in every step. The townspeople watched in stunned silence as dust rose around his boots. No laughter now. Only the heavy weight of their own ugliness hanging in the air. Eliza buried her face against his chest. Not from shame, from something she hadn't felt in 3 years. Safety, and that was the day the joke stopped being funny. Life at the edge of town. Caleb's ranch sat beyond the river bend, where the land turned wild and quiet. It wasn't large, it wasn't polished, but it was his. He carried her inside that small wooden house as if entering sacred ground. He set her down gently on the bed he had built himself years ago. "I don't have much," he said honestly, "but what I have I'll share." Eliza studied him carefully. "Why?" she asked. He paused. "Because you're not a joke." The words broke something inside her. That night, Red Hollow waited for him to return her, to admit defeat, to complain. He didn't. Instead, he built. The next morning, before sunrise, Caleb began hammering wood beside the porch. By afternoon, he had constructed a wide ramp leading into the house. By evening, he had modified a saddle into something stronger, something supportive. Each day he adapted his world around her, not as burden, but as partnership. When he rode out to check cattle, he secured her safely in front of him. When he worked in the fields, he placed her beneath shade with a clear view of the horizon. He spoke to her constantly, not like someone fragile, like someone equal. And slowly Eliza began to change. The girl who had hidden in shadows started laughing again. She began reading aloud to him at night. She stitched maps, planned crop rotations, suggested fencing improvements. She had always been sharp. The town had just never cared to notice. One evening, weeks later, as sunset painted the sky gold and crimson, Caleb stood her upright beside the fence, her arms hooked around his shoulders. "Lean on me," he said. Her legs trembled violently. "I can't," she breathed. "You can try." And she did. One step. It lasted half a second, but to her it felt like flying. He didn't cheer loudly. He didn't dramatize it. He just smiled softly. "Told you." From that day forward they practiced. Every evening. One step. Then two. Then three. And the wind carried whispers back to Red Hollow. The joke was working too well. Because the paralyzed bride, she was standing. And the quiet cowboy, he wasn't shrinking. He was rising. The turning point. Months passed. And then came the Harvest Fair, the same annual celebration where the town once laughed at Caleb. This time, he rode in with Eliza beside him, not hidden, not carried. She wore a soft blue dress, seated tall in a custom saddle he had built for her. The town fell silent as they entered. The sheriff stepped, forward again, smirk returning. "Well, I'll be. Looks like she ain't dead weight after all." Caleb didn't respond. He simply dismounted, turned, and helped her down. But this time, she stood. On her own, not perfectly, not steady, but standing. The entire town watched her legs tremble and hold, her chin lifted. "I was never the joke," she said clearly. "You were." And in that moment, something shifted in Red Hollow, because the strongest person there wasn't the loudest man. It was the woman they tried to bury in shame, and the cowboy who refused to let her stay there. Red Hollow did not forgive easily. A town built on pride and dust had little room for humility, and even less room for being proven wrong. What Caleb Boone had done that day at the harvest fair had unsettled something deep inside its people. He had not shouted. He had not demanded apology. He had not thrown their cruelty back at them. He had simply loved louder than their mockery, and that was far more dangerous. For weeks after the fair, whispers moved like wind through the saloon doors and across the hitching posts. "She won't keep standing. He's wasting his time." Sooner or later, reality'll break them. But reality did not break them. It shaped them. Each sunrise found Caleb already awake, stepping quietly from bed so he wouldn't disturb. Eliza, he would step outside into the gray dawn, breathe in the cold air, and thank God for another day he could fight beside her. Not for her. Beside her. Inside, Eliza would wake to the smell of coffee and fresh bread. She had begun insisting on helping with breakfast. Caleb built lower counters, installed sturdy rails along the walls, crafted handholds from polished oak. He did not build her a world of limitation. He built her leverage. At first, her steps were short and trembling. Her legs felt like strangers beneath her. Some days they refused to obey at all. Those days were the hardest. Not because of pain, but because of memory. Memory of being wheeled out as a joke. Memory of laughter. On those mornings, doubt would creep in quietly. "I'm slowing you down," she whispered once, staring at her unmoving legs. Caleb knelt in front of her, the same way he had that first day in town. "You're teaching me patience," he said calmly. "That ain't slowing down. That's growing up." She laughed softly through tears. But Red Hollow was not done testing them. The drought came without warning. By late summer, the river bent low and thin. Grass yellowed. Cattle weakened. Ranchers grew desperate. And desperation makes men crueler than boredom ever could. The sheriff called a town meeting beneath a large oak near the church. Every rancher gathered, hats low over tense faces. Caleb stood near the back. Eliza seated beside him on a sturdy bench he had built specifically for public gatherings. The sheriff's voice carried heavy. "Water's scarce. We ration it. That means every ranch proves its worth. The weak ones won't survive this season." Eyes shifted. Toward Caleb. His ranch was smaller, his cattle fewer, and now he had what they still called, quietly, a burden. "We vote," the sheriff declared. "Whose land gets priority access to the north well?" Murmurs grew. Eliza's fingers tightened around the bench. She knew what this meant. If Caleb lost access to the well, his cattle would die. Without cattle, the ranch would collapse. Without the ranch, everything they built would vanish. The votes were cast by raised hands. One by one, Caleb stood straight, saying nothing. Eliza watched the count. It was close. Closer than she expected. But in the end, they lost. By 2 hands. The sheriff removed his hat slowly. "Sorry, Boone, business is business." "Business." Caleb nodded once. He did not argue. He simply helped Eliza stand, steadying her as she found her balance. Together they walked back to their horse under the heavy silence of those who had just chosen survival over fairness. That night Eliza did not sleep. Not because of fear, because of resolve. Before dawn, she asked Caleb to take her to the northern ridge of their property, the highest point overlooking the dry land. He carried her up the rocky slope when her legs failed halfway. At the top, wind pulled at her hair and dress as the world stretched wide before them. "Why here?" he asked gently. She pointed to a narrow strip of darker soil far beyond the dried riverbed. "There," she said. Caleb narrowed his eyes. "That's nearly a mile out?" "The ground dips," she continued. "Where ground dips, water settles underground longer. My father taught me that." Caleb looked at her fully then. Hope flickered. "You're thinking there's still water?" "I'm thinking no one else looked close enough." He studied the land again. It was risky. Digging required time, strength, resources they didn't have to waste. But Caleb had learned something important since marrying Eliza. She did not speak on impulse. She observed. He nodded slowly. "Then we dig." For 3 days they worked without rest. Caleb dug until his palms split. Eliza sat nearby, directing where to widen, where to deepen. She calculated soil density. Not guessed, calculated. Years of sitting quietly in the back room of her uncle's. House had given her something. Unexpected. Time to think. By the 4th day, the town began to notice the dust cloud rising from Caleb's land. "They're desperate," someone muttered at the saloon. But on the 5th morning, Caleb's shovel struck damp earth. He froze, dug faster. And then, water. Not a flood, not a miracle, but a steady, cold seep rising through soil like breath returning to lungs. Caleb dropped to his knees laughing, a rare, unrestrained sound. He carried Eliza down into the shallow pit and lifted her, carefully, as the water pooled around his boots. "You saw it," he whispered in awe. She smiled, tears streaking her dusty cheeks. "We found it." Within days, Caleb built a simple pump. Word spread fast. The town gathered again, this time not to laugh, to ask. The sheriff approached cautiously. "We hear you found something." Caleb wiped his hands clean. "Yes." "Care to share?" Silence stretched. This was the moment. The chance for revenge. The opportunity to deny them what they had denied him. Eliza squeezed his hand. Caleb met the sheriff's gaze. "Water's for keeping things alive," he said evenly. "Not for punishing mistakes." And just like that, the ranch they tried to starve became the one that saved them. Wagons lined up daily to fill barrels. Ranchers who once mocked now nodded respectfully. Some even removed their hats to Eliza, because they knew it wasn't luck. It was her mind. Autumn came softer that year. Grass returned in patches of green. Cattle regained strength, and Red Hollow began speaking their names differently, not as joke, not as pity, but as proof. One evening, as sunset painted the sky gold and rose, Caleb stood with Eliza at the ridge again. She was standing longer now, walking farther. Her steps were not perfect, but they were hers. "You raised me," she said quietly. Caleb shook his head. "I just refused to let you stay down." She looked toward the horizon. "They tried to give you something broken." He smiled faintly. "They gave me someone untested." Wind moved gently between them. "You know," she said softly, "I used to think being carried meant weakness." Caleb slid his arm around her waist as her legs trembled. "Sometimes being carried," he replied, "is how you learn you can stand." Below them, the town lights began to glow one by one, not because Red Hollow had changed completely. Towns don't change overnight. But something had shifted. They had witnessed strength that didn't shout, love that didn't boast, resilience that didn't ask permission, and higher than the rooftops, higher than the sheriff's pride, higher than the cruel laughter that once filled the air, stood a woman who had been paralyzed, and a cowboy who never once saw her that way. They tried to make him small. Instead, he rose, and he lifted her so high that even the horizon had to look up.